In this video you'll learn how to have these enemies moving, and we can fire with the space bar, and if you get hit it restarts and it pauses on you, and you can see you have 3 lives down at the bottom, and you're going and trying to get enough enemies to destroy before they reach the bottom of the screen, and if you lose all 3 lives you'll lose the game. So hope you guys enjoy. Okay, so if we drop down, focus in on our main camera, and we actually change our layout a little bit, you can drag this all the way to the left, drag this all the way to the left, and then we can actually move this so it's below. I want my scene window to be a little bit larger and go all the way down to the bottom for this asteroid shooter game. Makes it just a little bit easier and nicer to play with, and we got enough room here where we could shrink this down a bit. And I've actually saved this as a specific kind of layout. You can call it whatever you want, but I just called it big center window. You know, then you have this for any game that's more of a block type game and has a little bit more height to it than what we've had before. It just makes it easier to see some stuff. So if you then go into your assets, as of now in this saved big center, I also have it as 1 column layout. I'm going to go ahead and change it to 2 column layout for this, so that I can see the folders and the assets that I put in, and they're not just little tiny texts right there. So if I go to folder and I create a sprites folder, I've done this in previous games, and how I do it is very simple. I get a white block, and that is one of my sprites. So I simply go and get a white block PNG file, and you can do that by using the snipping tool if you're on Windows, or you can screen capture on a Mac, and if you just create a little block here of really any size, we can manipulate that block, and if you save it, and I saved mine as white block, and then you can use that to easily drag something in, manipulate the size, and it's just easier to make that as a 2D image than going in and then you have to create a sprite and drag the sprite in, or you can create a 3D object that's pretty flat, and it's just a little harder to manipulate. I feel like this is the easiest way to create something. So I'm gonna go ahead and make it about the size of the world. You know, we'll edit this as we go a little bit. I'll make it all the way go to the top of the world. So okay, there's a little bit of room on the sides here, but so if I go to my color and I go make it black, I know I'm gonna make it space. And I can go to my white block and I notice it's a little off center. I can make my X value 0, and I know that'll move it over, and I can make my Y value 0, or you can go in here and reset, but that would reset the scale. So Control Z, but if I just change my position, that'll make it easy there. So the next thing we're going to do is make a particle effect, and so after we rename this, so let's rename this just our background, and we can make a effects particle system. And this particle system I'm going to rename as star effect. And so as of now, this just goes straight up in the air, and that's just kind of the default. And so if you move your Y value to 10, it'll go up kind of where we want it to go. We're gonna have our Z position go ahead and be 0 as well, and we're going to make a couple changes here. So our rotation for our X is going to be 90. Okay, now that flips it so it is facing down. Okay, so if in your particle system you will go to the effects and change some of these, I'm going to go through all the things, and if I kind of hit these right in a row, it might be a little easier for you guys. So I changed my duration from 5 to 10. I checked pre-warm. I changed my lifetime from 5 to 50. So that really got the length of time these will survive, these particles will live right at the right size. I have my speed to be 0.01, so it barely moves. They barely move, and if you don't change the gravity, they won't even really get much past this. Okay, and then I have my start size to be incredibly small, so 0.05 to 0.01, and that is random between 2 constants. Okay, and that's our start size. Rotation, all the same. Down to gravity modifier, I changed this from 0 to 0.0001. This allows for the stars to slowly fall, and based off the size and the mass, some will fall just a fraction faster than others and have a little bit of movement. And then we go into our shape. And the shape, I changed my angle from being at 25 to being 0. And that made it so that it, instead of having a cone effect, it kind of fell down and has that like chandelier effect where it just falls straight flat down. And then that's all I did with my particle system. The position I put at 10, so it would be above. So here's 5 and here's 10 for my Y value. And then I rotated the X 90 degrees so that it would flip from facing up to facing down. And then I scaled it up just a little bit, so about 7.5 on each of these, so that it's evenly scaled. And so now when I run this, I could even make my stars smaller than that, and I actually will. So I'll go 0.1 to 0.005. So, and then if I run that, here you can really see us falling through space, and so that's just a really great background, a great look to it. So I'm really happy with that. So if we keep going, the next thing we're going to want to do is create our object. And so instead of creating a 2D object in Sprite and dragging that in and all this other stuff, I'm going to show you guys now that you can actually go into the asset store, and there's a ton of different options. And if you just click this assets button, or you can get to it through a browser as well. But if you go to the asset store, you can always click open in browser. Usually that's a little bit faster. This seems to be a little bit slower, but more convenient. So if I do a search and I do spaceship, I've already looked it up, and I make it 2D free, you get pretty good variety of things that you can download and create. So I've downloaded this 3D Jeeves, and so you click on it and you would download, and then you would click import. And so I'm just going to show you that import process. So once you click import, it will have these different, not only these different images, prefabs that you can see, but also some of the animation that you can do with them. So this will be a really cool addition. So this kind of separates the computer graphics person that can design some of the images and sprites in a game, and the game designer. And so now that those are imported in, you can see the spaceship. We can rename Space Sprites. Okay. And so we can drag this into our sprites folder where we have our white block, and we can separate it out so that it's specific to the space sprites. Okay, and so you can click in there, and they actually already have prefabs, and the reason they do is because these are not just sprites anymore. People can add different things to these prefabs in this folder, and they can do anything from having code in there to just simply having an animator, and that's what we have here. So if we drag in our spaceship, you can choose whichever one you want. I notice I can't see my spaceship. That's because if I need to click on my background and go to additional settings and make this -1, so it always shows up in the background. And we'll have our ship be a little bit smaller, about take up, let's see, I think I want it to about take up one full square here. There we go. Yeah, that's about the size I want. It doesn't have to be perfect. I'm going to rotate it, and I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees on the Z value. And so I can see right here, this will be the Z value. Actually, I want to switch it, flip it all the way around, so 180. And now we have our ship, and if we run it, it already has that animator in it. And so let's see what this animation does. I believe it has these lights flickering a little bit, and has some stuff blowing out the back, some flames for our rockets and stuff. So feel free to experiment with a few different assets packages. That's just one I found that looked like an animator. I could see if I put a bunch of these in here, it'll look a lot like asteroids. And so that's kind of what I'm going for. Don't get hung up by spending way too much time trying to figure out the absolute perfect graphics. Wait for your big projects that you really need the graphics to be absolutely perfect to take up too much time focusing on that when you really need to focus on understanding the gaming logic and the programming side in order to even get to that final game step. And so don't waste your time now on graphics if you're trying to focus on learning how to build the game right now. Okay, so if we actually run this, you can see what these spaceships do, and these will be our enemy spaceships. Now, you could go all the way to making the pixel graphics of old times of the asteroids and use that as well if you want. So, just up to you. So, now that we have our spaceship, let's go ahead and delete these for now. We're going to rename this, and we're going to rename it our player. And this player is going to be different than what this prefab is. So we're going to need to go in to our assets folder and create a prefabs folder. And so here we can store the prefab specific to this game. Yes, that was a prefab. Okay, and so if we drag this into the prefabs folder, we can make it just an original prefab because this is the one that we're going to use and be connected to. So we want this to be the same, not a variant of the prefab. So now that we have that, we can go ahead and go back into our assets, create a scripts folder. Oh, I made a script instead of scripts folder. So you can go in and create a folder, scripts. Now, if you double click this and open up Visual Studio and even rename it here, this is something that can be quite confusing because you can go in and go into Visual Studio. So if we have Visual Studio up right here, you can see new behavior, and this is actually called new behavior script. Even if I rename this what I meant to call it before I jumped off of it, I meant to call it my, if you rename it, and what I meant to call it was my player script. It goes in and you open this up. So even after you rename it player, it might still have this new behavior script in there. You just want to make sure that this is called player. Okay, and then once you're in there, we've done this before of creating a way in order for us to move. Now, in order to move our player, we're going to be able to move all over the screen. So just WASD controls. So if input dot get key, and we will say key code dot right arrow. So you can do WASD or you can do the arrow keys. Then we're going to do transform dot translate, and we're going to do a new vector 3. And if you've done this before, this is the X, Y, and Z value, and we're going to change our X value, and we're going to make our X value move 5. And ours is going to be, if you want it to be a smooth mover, you can do it based off of frames. So you do 5 times time dot delta time, and then we can save it, make sure that works correctly before we do the other 4 directions. If you want to use WASD, whoops, you want to make sure that you do it negative here for the right direction. You can do negative 5 times time dot delta time, and then you want to do copy, paste, paste, paste. And if we do left, up, down, left will be positive 5, up, you put this X value in the Y value, so you put 0, comma, negative 5 times time dot delta time, and then this will be a positive in the Y value of the same value. So positive 5 times time dot delta time, and then you can run it. And you can move every direction, and this is pretty good speed that we got going. Okay. So actually, I'm going to put those if statements inside their own method called movement. And then if you copy and paste, and then we put movement in there. That way this can be organized and we can only call, right now we're always constantly calling this method, but sometimes we might not want to move, and we're going to have the game paused and I won't want to be able to move, and so later on we can do, if the game is paused, we can't move. So now we'll make another method called fire projectile. And so in order to do this, we will need to do similar if input dot get key down instead of just get key. Get key down just checks if you pressed it down, and you can do key code dot space. Okay, and we've actually done this in our platformer game, our previous video, of how to add something in the world randomly and on a timer. Now this, we're going to add an object, a projectile, into the world when we push space down. And so in order to do that, we will need to create a few different game objects. And so we're going to create a public game object that will be our projectile, and then public game object that will be our projectile clone. Now, here we're going to store the value of a prefab projectile. And then basically we're going to make a copy of that and have that be added into the game. So this can be our stored value of our prefab, and the clone is how we are able to make multiple copies of that. And so in order to make those copies, we're going to need to add in a projectile into the world. But we'll do projectile clone equals, and we'll instantiate a projectile prefab. So it'll know to grab the projectile prefab once we put that in. We haven't put that in yet. And then it says transform parent. So we could do new vector 3, and we could simply do 0, 0, 0. As game object. Okay, it also wants rotation, and so we can do transform dot rotation. Okay, so then once we save that, we haven't added anything as the projectile, so it doesn't know what projectile clone will be. We also haven't added in our fire projectile command, method inside of our update method. So now I'm going to go back in and I'm going to add in a white block, and I'm going to change the size of this white block to look more like a little laser beam. Okay, and so I'm going to change its color to that light teal color, and then we'll be able to take a look at that, and that's good enough for now, and we can always change the size a little bit later. So that makes it really easy to see. So we're going to rename this projectile, and we can drag this into the prefabs folder as projectile, and then we can actually delete it right there. And then now our player needs to have inside of the player code this script, but actually not just in this specific player. I want this in the general prefab of player that we've created. So I'm going to go back to my scripts, make sure that this is added in, and this is actually in the prefab so that it'll auto update in here. And actually we can remove the first. So you could have removed the original player script and just make sure it's in the prefab. Okay, so if I go to my prefabs and in player, I have my player script. I can drag in, what is the projectile? Well, we need to drag in the projectile prefab. So we grab it, and we drag in into the projectile. Now the projectile clone will use the code to copy projectile and create a new one in that exact spot. So right now I'm adding in, and you can see over here we're adding in a bunch as we go. Now they don't move, and they're all stuck. If I go into scene view, I could probably move a few off of here and move them all around the screen. Okay, so what we need to do now is make some movement for our projectile. And we need to locate it not at 0, 0. So now we need to make sure that it's located, that the projectile gets located at the same location, similar location to our player. Okay, and so our player needs to have his own game object storage player. So we can reference player and say we want to be located, by the player. Okay, so in our player prefab, so if we save before we do any changes and we drag in and now we drag in our player into our game object, so it's basically checking for itself. Anytime we call player, we'll be referencing that. So if we do player dot transform dot position dot x, reference our player, transform their y dot and then but add 0.8f, and then the z value stays the same, and we'll have the rotation be player dot transform dot rotation, so the rotation is the same. Oh, whoops, you need to make sure that it's dot position dot y. Okay, now we run it, and we have our projectiles added in right above it. Let's make it a little bit closer to it. Let's do 0.6. Okay. Now we want to have our new script for our projectiles to move, and so we can go into our scripts, create C# script projectile. Okay, and so let's open up the projectile script, and so our projectile is going to move at a constant speed based off of time. So we can just do the transform dot translate new vector 3, none on the x value. The y value will be do 3 times time dot delta time, because we want it to be each frame we want it to move, and then semicolon here. So you want this to be -3. Then if you go to your prefab projectile and open up this projectile inspector prefab window, and you click once on script, and you just click once and drag your projectile C# script inside of the projectile prefab in the inspector. Now when you run it, you will have projectiles that fire. Now they never get destroyed. You can see they'll go on forever. So we need to have a way to destroy them and do a few other things. So we don't need to worry about that quite yet though. Okay, so we have projectiles, and I don't think they go quite fast enough, so I'm going to change it to -5 for now, and we'll see if we need to change it later. But next thing I want to do is add in the enemies. And so if we go back to our sprites folder, so I've even downloaded sprites that look like this, and I've edited the background, and I've drug in the Space Invaders sprite, different colors and things like that. You're welcome to do that. That might take a little bit more time, a little bit easier just to download pre-made sprites, especially when they also have animation. It just makes it a little bit more fun. Okay, so I'm gonna duplicate these and add them and have them just be each unit. So I'm actually going to scale these down to 2 by 2, and I'm going to duplicate, and if you hold control down, you'll see that you can, if you see the X value, watch it here, you can move it and select it, and it'll move every quarter of a unit. So that way it can snap to those positions, and I can quickly and easily just make 8 little enemy ships here, and then I can control space, and I can do control, and I did control D to duplicate each one, and then if I hold control down and move it, I can move them down and have them be perfectly lined up, and makes it nice and easy. Now, if you go ahead and you create, and if it's under something for now, that's alright, we can move it out. So you want to move this game object out and not have it be, you want to have it be on its own. Okay, and we'll rename this game object our enemies. And that way we can click on all of these, and actually I like to do Control A, that'll grab everything, and then unhighlight, holding control down and clicking, and that will unhighlight the main camera and the sample scene. Then I can let go of everything and drag them under the enemies. Now if I get rid of the drop down, it will it'll get rid of that for me. And really I wanted this prefab to be located in here. So I'm going to drag this prefab in. I know that's a little different than how we did it with the player, and I probably should have done it the other way, but that should be fine for now. And so I'm just going to call it enemy. And if I need to reload the prefab and resave it in here, that's fine. We can do that later, but for now this will work. These enemies will move and bounce back and forth, and they'll come down the screen. And so we can go ahead and move our player all the way back to start. They don't get hit by the projectiles quite yet, but they will. And so what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to create a box collider 2D, make sure it's 2D, and a rigid body. So type in rigid body 2D, except we are not, since it's a 2D game, we will not have gravity involved. And because we're going up, it's not a platform or anything. And so same thing we're going to do for our enemies prefab. And so our enemies prefab are going to need a rigid body 0, and they're going to need a box collider, or they could actually have a polygon collider, but because our projectiles are going to be fired straight, it shouldn't really matter whether you do a polygon or a box. And we should be able to see, if this works correctly, that when we fire and we actually hit somebody, we should move them. And you can see, that's pretty cool, huh? They can just bounce around in there. And so we don't want that necessarily to happen, but at least we're detecting the projectiles right now. And so what we're going to do is when our projectile collides with an enemy, on collision, enter 2D. So if collision.gameObject.tag equals enemy, so we're going to need to create a tag for our enemy objects, and we're going to need to give them all in their prefab a tag of enemy. And we can say if that happens, we want to destroy what we collided into, which was our enemy. So we're going to destroy that game object, and we will also destroy ourselves. So you can do self, and there's different ways that you can have things set up so that you can actually access ourselves, but we're going to go ahead and just create a public game object self, and we can have that. Actually, I'm going to call it projectile, and I'm going to call it projectile down here, just to make sure that even if anybody that came into our code would really know exactly what this is. So we need to assign the projectile code now has a public projectile object, and so it's going to be itself. And so when we collide with the game object with the tag of enemy, so we need to have our enemy prefab have a tag. So we go into our tag and we're going to add a tag, and the list is empty. So we're going to add a enemy tag that we save. Then you need to click back into tag and assign the prefab as enemy. Now that the prefab is assigned as an enemy, and if we move and hit a player, we remove them from the world. So you can see how that's working for us. Okay, excellent. So moving forward, so in the real Space Invaders, and you can decide if you want to do it this way or not, you can only create one projectile into the world at once. So you have to fire the projectile. It has to hit something before you can create another one. So if you want to do that, you need to do an and projectile must equal null, meaning it must equal nothing. There must not be a projectile that exists. And actually that's going to be projectile clone, and that cannot exist. So then once we push space down, we will make it, and it will exist. And then as it exists and lives in the world until it gets destroyed, we will not be able to create another one, because the projectile clone will not equal null. It will equal the projectile that we're creating. Okay, so then if we have that, then we can only do one at a time. Okay, so there's a variety of ways you can have your enemies move. We can have our enemies move, and we can have boundaries that we hit. You can have it on a timer. You can do a few different things. You can have just them animate, but I want it to look as close as I can to the original Space Invaders. Okay, so what we're going to need to do is create a script for our enemy. And so if we go into our scripts folder, we're going to create a C# script, and this can just be enemy, and our enemy is going to constantly be counting up, and it'll only move over certain periods of time. So we're going to create a float that's a timer. We'll start at equal to 0, and we're going to have a float that is a time to move, and that's going to equal 0.5f. And so our timer is going to add up based off time.delta time. And then we're going to say if our timer is greater than time to move, we are going to transform.translate. We're going to do a new vector3 0.1f 0 0. Okay, so it should move about 0.1 to the right. We go to our enemies prefab, and we grab the script and we drag it into our prefab here. We can drag it to the bottom. Easiest way is right there, add component. Then we have our enemy script, and our enemy script says we're going to be moving to the left on a certain timer, or excuse me, move to the right, their left, on a certain timer. And then we're going to need to reset our timer to equal 0 so that it resets. Okay, this will have a little bit more of a stutter effect. It'll be a wait and move, similar to the original Space Invaders. And we can make changes to that as we go. Okay, so we can increase this if we want, or increase the speed, time to move, decrease it so it goes faster as well. So what we need to do is find a way to time this out so that it will move back to the left at the correct time. So based off of what we have here, where we're moving 0.1 to the right. So if we hold control down, we can, and then go over, we can actually count how many shifts if we were going 0.25 units over each time. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, about 14. So if we did this 14 times and moved it over 0.25, which is what I think I'm going to switch it to because I would like to move it a little bit more, it would take 14 shifts in order for us to go down to the next line. And so we're going to have a counter that counts float num of movements. We're going to start it equal to 0, and that actually isn't going to be a float since we're counting. It's going to be an int. And we're going to have our num of movements to add up 1. And we're going to say if the num of movements is equal to 14, which is what we said, we are going to move down 1. So we can copy, paste, and we can actually put this at probably 0.5f. We can see if that's the right amount to move it down. And then we can set number of movements equal to 0. And we can make this have a float speed, which will equal the 0.25 f. And we can replace that with speed. And then if it equals 14, we can have speed equal negative speed. So it starts moving the other way. And number of movements will go back to 0, and it'll go 14 movements the other way. Okay, so let's see how that works. So if you save, okay, we'll see if it lines up pretty good. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 13, 14, and it's moving the wrong way. Okay, otherwise it was pretty good. So we want to make sure that it goes down closer. Might just want to make this -1. Move down. Let's see how many. So I move it 1, 2, 3, 4, about 5 before you're running into the player, which I think is okay. See if it bounces back the other way. And it does. So what we can do here is say and our number of movements does not equal 14, so that when it does equal 14 and it does move down, it will not keep moving sideways as it has with that last diagonal. And I'm actually going to set this so when we reset, we go back to -1. This will make it so that on this last control space, when we shift back, going back to the left, we will go 1 more over so it really reaches all the way to the edge. And we'll just kind of experiment and see how that works. So now we move down and it looks pretty good. So let's change this to less than 14. So once it's on 14, on 13 it'll move, but once it's on 14 it'll skip it, and we can switch sides. So then if you make your timer equal 0, so it resets the timer so it doesn't move right at the very end one last time. Now we have our enemies moving, and we have them moving at a speed, and now we have these different variables that we can control. If we change time to move to something smaller, they'd move at a quicker tempo. If we had the number of movements, they could move wider if we wanted to extend the size of our world, or the speed at which the distance at which they moved. That's kind of what the speed is essentially. So A lot of things we can do there. So, okay, now let's go ahead and have our enemies fire back at us. So, in order to do that, we can do void fire enemy projectile, just so we have the difference between the two. And so, we're going to say if a random number, range, 0f, comma, we'll say 500f. So we're getting a random number between random decimal number between 0 and 500. And so if that happens to be less than 1, basically between 0.0 and 0.9 repeating, we will do something very similar that we've already done. And so we're going to go ahead and copy and paste. Copy, and we're going to make a few changes here, but paste. But we're going to actually use some of the same variables. So public game object, and we can still call it projectile. I think it might be better to call it enemy projectile. Even though we are in their code, it still would be nice to be really explicit on exactly what we want to have happen. So game object enemy projectile clone. By all means, you can call them just projectile, but and then we need to go back in here and do enemy projectile and enemy projectile clone. And then, of course, the last thing we need to make public game object, and this would be ourselves or the enemy. And so I'm going to switch these to enemy. Like I said, you could probably name that player even and know what you're talking about, but honestly, it usually, more often than not, confuses you later down the road, and it's just, that didn't take long at all for me, and so it's really worth the extra little bit of time just to avoid confusion later. Now I'm subtracting the distance, and now I don't know the exact distance. I think the enemy is a little bit smaller, and this is used so we are at the front of the enemy. So in our player, we added so we were at the front when we were firing a projectile. And then here we're going down a little bit less. And so I'm going to copy and paste. And really this doesn't matter, doesn't exactly matter where it is in the code. I think it's nice to have it near the bottom so we move first and then we fire our projectile instead of firing our projectile and within the same frame moving. So I think it's smartest to have it probably at the bottom here. And so Control S, and now that we're back in here, we want to go to our prefabs, and within Unity, we have this enemy script, and we got a bunch of stuff we need to put in. So the enemy needs to know where we're going to add the projectile in relation to itself. So that would be the enemy. The enemy projectile, we're going to need to make a enemy projectile prefab. So I'm going to make a duplicate of projectile. I'll rename it enemy projectile, you guessed it. I can, since it was the white block sprite originally, we can change the look of it to be closer to red. And then in our enemy, and then in our enemy script, we can drag in our enemy projectile, and then that is how the clone will be made. We'll copy the enemy projectile to create the enemy projectile clone. So we should see, oh, now we know, I actually know that it's working. If you slowed it down, you can see, oh, projectile is barely popping out, but they're injuring themselves because, if you remember, this has our projectile script, which says if the projectile is running into a tag of enemy, then it will destroy itself. So it's really probably a little bit easier to remove this component, add a new script, and call it enemy projectile script. And so now we can copy most of the stuff that we've done in our projectile, and yeah, we're going to need to make some changes to it, but not all that much, and we can paste over. Let's see, make sure we get this right. Yeah, my curly brackets are all lined up. Okay, paste over, and we can do a few things here. So instead of having it be enemy, it's going to be if we hit the player, we'll destroy the player. And our vector, we're going to be moving the opposite direction. So that will be how that looks, and it will destroy our enemy projectile when we hit the player. And we're going to need to add in public game object enemy projectile, so that'll be the self. And so if we go into our prefabs, enemy projectile doesn't have the script in there yet, so we need to go in and add the enemy projectile script to our enemy projectile prefab. The enemy projectile, I need to make sure I save. Yep, Control S, because that did not show up. So now it will show up with that enemy projectile holder, and we're going to drag in our enemy projectile prefab so that the script can read it as itself. And so now if we collide with player, we will destroy what we collide with, which is player, and we'll also destroy our enemy projectile. So now we do need a box collider. Oh, we do have a box collider on our enemy, so they don't destroy the enemy anymore, but we do have the box collider because we copied it from the projectile. And so here's the thing, we know those are never going to move, and we never want them to move, so we can do something in our rigid body here and have some constraints, and we can freeze all of these. So we know we're never going to have those turn or anything like that, so we can do that in our enemy and our rigid body. Same thing with our player, who's going to need a box collider and a rigid body 2D, box collider 2D, and no gravity. We're also going to give them constraints so that doesn't move. And really, you could do the same thing with your enemy projectile. We never want any of these to turn or get shifted. Basically, they're either going to remove themselves and remove something else from the world. We need to transform negative, apparently. Maybe we're facing a different way than I expected, but regardless, now we're facing down and we're moving and nothing's hurting us, nothing's running into us. So we need to have our player get injured or removed if we run into the projectile. The reason that's not working is our player is not tagged as player. So if this has already been pre-made as one of the default tags that they have, so we'll have player in there, and that should cause our boom to hit us and we're destroyed. Okay, so what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to make a new sprite white block, and I'm going to drag it in up here. And I'm going to have it be quite a bit larger than this even. Okay, there we go. And I'll have it be black so it blends in case we wanted to move it, but I'm going to move it right on the edge, so right when we hit the edge, our projectile will be destroyed. At least that's the goal. Rename edge of scene. Sure. Okay, so when we hit the edge of the screen, edge of the scene, we are going to get removed. And so we can name this something like respawn. So our projectile can respawn or finish. It doesn't matter what we name it there. We could add our own tag in. But we will have our own projectile, so the regular projectile. If it hits not enemy tag, but we said finish, we will destroy ourself, which is the projectile, Okay, now we go into our edge of scene and we make a box collider and we make a rigid body 2D and we freeze our X and Y, and that actually will stop gravity from doing anything to us. And so now, even if we push to the edge of the screen, we can still create another projectile later on because it gets destroyed. I challenge you to try to do the same thing for yourself for the enemies at the bottom of the screen, but I will do that as well now. So I created an edge of scene. I'll rename it to bottom of scene, and it will have some of the same properties, and we will actually be able to, since our enemy projectiles move the same way, move in opposite directions as our projectiles, we can also have that same code added into our enemy projectile class, and they won't trip over each other and there won't be any problems, okay? But instead of destroying the regular projectile, we're going to destroy the enemy projectile. Okay, so now both directions something will get destroyed, and we can just check on that. So if I go into the scene, yeah, they're getting destroyed right there. If I go into the game, that's getting destroyed right there. Excellent. Okay, so I'm just gonna cosmetics change this to black so it matches everything else. I don't really want anything to take away from the look of the game, and so I'm also going to extend the effects width. So if you go down to the star effects, the width right now is just that large. In order to increase the size of that, you would need to go to the shape, and the radius we would just extend just a little bit to like 0.3, and that'll be right outside of it, so perfect. Okay, so now our particle effect, our stars, will spread across the entire screen and really come down on a nice look. And our colored background is black so that we can actually move around. And when the projectiles are quite a bit too fast, probably too strong. But you can decide on the speed at which you want to do it, but I'm going to increase mine for my enemies, and that would be this random range. I'm going to go ahead and do 750 here. Give it a little bit more, less likely that it'll happen. Okay, now what I want to do is make multiple lives, and so what we're going to have happen is we're going to have, if our player gets hit, we're going to pause the game and not let anyone move anymore. And we're going to add in a new player up here, but our lives will go down, our number of lives. So the first thing with that we need to do is create a empty game object that we are going to call Game Manager. And this is where we manage some of the overall gameplay. And so this will not have any individual statistics for any one of these objects, and it won't even be added in and visually be there. But it is just the general background information that will always be in our game, such as lives, the ability to pause the game, as well as a few other things. So our game manager is going to need a script for create C# script game manager, and this is a common script, so it'll even change the icon of the C# script, but don't get confused. It is simply just a regular C# script. You can double click on it and open up Game Manager. And some things that we can do with the Game Manager will we'll be able to save our lives, and since it is always in the game, it is nice that we can have a number of lives that is always there for us. So we are going to have that, and we're gonna have a public static bool play game. Okay, and so we're gonna start with that being false. So since this is static, if we do game manager dot anywhere in any of these classes, we can access this play game. Okay, and so if our player gets hit by a projectile, so if we go actually into our enemy projectile, and we hit, the enemy projectile hits the player, I can do game manager dot play game equals false. So we pause and freeze the game. So in order to pause the game, we're going to need to add some stuff to our enemy, and we're going to need to say that this game manager dot play must be true in order for the enemy to move or fire. Okay, so in our if statement, you can add if game manager dot play game equals true, or you could just do if game manager dot play game, and that will automatically check if it's true. We can encapsulate all of this and say that only things in the ifs in the update method will happen if game manager dot play game is true. Okay, so if we save that, we can play, and now play game is not true, so everything is paused, because play game starts out as false. So if we started out at true, and then when we get hit, it should pause and the enemy should stop moving. So they move and they fire, but then when we get hit, we get destroyed, but everything pauses. Okay, the enemies won't move, the enemies won't fire. Okay, because that's what happens in the Space Invaders game. When you get hit and you get a new life, you actually get some time to reset up and refire your position. So now the problem is that we only have one life. Our player actually only will get destroyed. So we're actually going to remove that, and we're going to relocate it back to the original position. Okay, so collision.gameObject.transform.position equals, and we're going to need to give it a new vector, and so we want this to be vector3 respawn, and just so if we want to change where the respawn location is, we'll get a new vector3, and we're going to put it at 740 for the z value, and so this will relocate it to this exact spot on the map, and we're going to have transform equal respawn, and so that should reposition the player, not translate it, which would just move it from where it originally was. We're going to set the new position to the respawn point. So when we run it, we get hit, and then the enemies freeze. Now, usually when you hit a new enemy, then the game will start playing again. So even if you miss over here, it shouldn't start playing, but if you hit an enemy, it will play again. And so we need to put in our projectile, when we hit an enemy, we want the game manager dot play game to equal true, so it plays again. So we hit, we get relocated, but then when we fire and miss, nothing happens, but if we hit, we'll start moving again. Then if we get destroyed, we won't move, but then we'll move again. Okay, so now we want to add in a way to show our lives and to have our lives decrease every time we get hit, and only have a limited number of lives in order to lose, and then if you destroy all the enemies, we'll win the game. Okay, so if we go in and add a new UI, text, this can be renamed lives, and we can double click, and this will give us our UI screen, and this is where our text will show up. And so if we move this up into the upper left, we can edit what's on lives here. Start off at however many you want to give us, but 3, and we'll make this a little bit brighter so we can see, and we can actually move this just a little bit over so we can see it a little bit easier. Okay, and you can increase the size a little bit if you'd like. Yeah, I'll leave it like that. That looks good. Okay, so now we need to have our lives change and decrease as we go down. So in order to have our lives count down, we're going to need to go into our game manager, and there's a few different ways you can do this, but we can make lives static, and we can say that if we are fired upon, our game manager dot lives minus minus, that will allow us to subtract our lives every time we get hit, and we will be relocated and it will pause the game. Okay, and then in order for our lives to show up, we need to go into our game manager. We'll need to do public text and lives, and it's got to be something different than lives. So lives score or lives text. I'm gonna have it be lives text, and then you can drag in this text into your game manager. And if we save, we can go into our game manager and then drag lives text right in there. Okay, and so now our game manager will adjust based off what lives is. What we need to do now is have our lives text dot text. So the text in lives text will equal our lives colon space, and then we need to add a variable to it, lives, and so our lives equal will equal 3. But when we get hit, this lives static number will go down. So if we Control S and save, Control S and save, that will make this go down every time we get hit. Okay, and then we need to also not only have it at the start, we copy and paste that and have it in the update, so that live text is always being updated constantly. And in our lives text, we can actually get rid of this, and it will always be updating in our code. And so when we run this again at the start, lives text will equal 3, because that's what we started it as. But then because we have it in the update, it will always update with it and go along with it. Now the problem is, if we hit and get hit, we can get to -1. We don't want that. Okay, so we can go in. So in our update, we can say if our lives equals 0, we're going to have an end screen text. So end screen dot text equals you lose. Okay, and then if we go in and say public text end screen, and we create a new end screen text. So we add in another text. So you can right click UI text and have it be a part of the canvas. Canvas automatically will load up, and we want that to be our end screen text, and that can be a you lose or a you win. We can have that be a little bit larger. You can have it centered. We'll have it be blank to start, so nothing will display at the beginning. And we want our end screen text to not be gray, because that's our color. And let's just go ahead and make a different color than white, like the lives, just to change it up. Okay, so now that we've made the end screen text, we need to go back into our game manager and drag end screen into its placeholder. And if we play, we can lose the game, and you lose will show up as your end screen. Now, we also need to make some adjustments so we can't keep playing the game, because right now we can. And so we can go into our player, code, and we could say if lives is greater than 0, we will move and be able to fire projectiles. And that will allow us, now it's not going to be just lives, it has to be game manager.lives. That will allow so we can't move or fire any more projectiles when our score gets to 0. And we can lose the game. Okay, and now I can't move, I can't fire. My enemies pause as well. So this is where I'm going to stop the tutorial. I challenge you guys to go ahead and move forward and try to create a you win screen based off if you have destroyed all the objects. You can either search through Unity and maybe look up online how to find out if there's any more enemy prefabs left in the scene. You also could have you lose the game if the enemies reach the bottom of the screen. But I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and as always, if you felt like it was very helpful, I appreciate a like and subscribe so you don't miss the next video. Thanks for watching. Bye.